The anniversary of Kennedy's assassination occasioned a lot of conversation and commentaries about its sway on political thought in the ensuing years. That would make some sense. Much like the 9/11 attacks 12 years back, one expects outsized influence from conscious searing events. And yet, if a theory I've met this past year has it right, the source of partisan views is found not in present-day events, but were set largely by a region's founders' background and past. This United States is really an amalgam of 11 nations, it is argued, that on many issues reflect politically values that region's settlers brought with them. Talk about the dead hand of history ruling from the grave. When values are essentially inbred, they aren't seen as distinct. In fact, they've become the lens through which all else is seen. Over time, we've called out one issue or another, human rights having been most recent, for collective review. We see there's a judgment, we consider our values. At once, this is no longer the air we breathe. It becomes a fitter expression of us. We become stronger. Mindfulness, I think. When I see that I have a response to something and I then ask what it's about, I start to know why my reaction. But it's what happens then that gets interesting. Why essentially represents some value, one I most likely not consciously considered. When I see that value, I see others that maybe counsel different reactions. What do I hold most dear? What matters the most to me? Is my unconscious reaction who I choose to be? Is another value more truly authentic to the man I would aspire to become? In that moment of mindfulness, creation gathers nigh. What values best express the man I want to become? The self? Community? Nation? Species? Abstractions, to be sure, yet in the ensuing choice, the very way reality manifests becomes set. Maybe it's just a happy accident that creation is reaction revised. Maybe. But the opening to invent the future consciously, I'm convinced, lies in that moment. And the more aware we become of what's living in that tight wad of values called response, the more we see what's possible. The more we are like God. Yes, I know. It gets kind of touchy when God's name comes up, so please bear with me. Here's what I don't mean. A stern old man with gray hair and beard who, B, has a care what I do or did with my time on earth, 'cause, C, I'm to be eternally judged. If that God wanted results from my birth, it's something he'd have readily managed. I see divinity in creation. Creation needs a universe of choice. That serving divine inspiration is, of course, infinite. My still small voice draws on a rather more limited range of possibilities. One runs some by unseen, inbred judgment. The more I change unseen to reviewed, the more options my palette contains. And if we're created in God's image, as some say, then the more that awareness has repatriated possibility, well, We're that much more like God. But you say, couldn't God just as well have created man to be more aware of infinite choice? Why set up the fuss and bother of self-discovery? There must be a trail more sure than this slipshod pathway to consciousness. Here's my best guess. This journey is God creating more God. And there isn't a deadline for success. There may, however, be some limits on our species' opportunity to make the journey. Whether or not we've gone beyond what is correctable mistake remains to be seen. Suffice it to say, our response thus far has been less than quick. And for what it's worth, I'm pretty sure praying to God to fix it won't do the trick. In my book of Genesis, God had a great time with evolution, seeing how this could become that, then creating a way usually more complex to allow it yet different life. And there came a time in my tale when the Creator created creating. And from that point on, I'm guessing she discontinued active play in this sandbox. When the created own the tools for creation, not to mention drive for self-preservation, if they've blown it, well, that's their too bad. The convention of good and bad, of divine reward or vengeance is irrelevant. Everyone goes home, whether we decide to ignore and party on or have somehow begun to adjust in sufficient time. It's not a divine, but an earthly solution needed. In our unraveling the knot of awareness, conscious evolution. I may have met grace, a sense of oneness, of all being interrelated, of the fragility of our humanness. Like seeing the whole of it wearing love-colored glasses, profoundly grateful for the opportunity to be. Reporting experience to the mind's a surefire way, best as I can tell, to abort the experience itself, which is why I'm only saying we, Grace and I, may have met. That, as well as the fact that my great good fortune took me out of the way of some of life's greatest challenges. I'm reasonably sure it's easier to be grateful and grace met when one's life and time have been as fortunate as my journey has been. There's always been shelter and sustenance. I can think, speak, create with rare political freedom. I've loved and been loved. I've grown and evolved from within and watched and been part of growth and evolution without. I enjoy being in my body, and it's supported me well. If grace depends somehow on seeing response to hardship in life, I'd be hard-pressed to qualify. Still, something about those moments, however they're described, scarred my spirit with sweet joy, inside and out. So how, I ask, can I get to that place consistently? What do I need to do to generate a rendezvous with grace on demand? I had a teacher once who I'm sure would have told me that I'm asking the wrong questions. It's not a how or do, but a be, he would have said. You're barking up the wrong tree. If you're after the blue sky that is divine possibility, it's all about being in the present. Having and doing are primarily seeing with the mind. But to be doesn't come from the mind. Being comes from spirit. useful advice till I try to figure out what precisely to do to follow it. Some years back, I suggested that one sure way to meet grace was to ask, what would love do now? And I still think that's a useful guideline. But it is another way of asking do, and I'm after be. Mindfulness might be a helpful way to get B to show up somewhat more reliably. That level of awareness would likely be prelude to grace, since presence must be prerequisite to probing the mystery of reaction. But perhaps the easiest way to meet up with grace would be me being the person my dog sees in me.